Bonjour et bien.
Good morning and welcome to our session on intermediate powers. I'm delighted to be your moderator. We have practically the most important topic of all. So we will begin immediately. We have 4 speakers. We have the Polish Minister of European Affairs, who's listening to the translation. Ignacy Niemczewski. Next to him, we have Karim El Ainaoui, who is the President Executive for the Policy Center of the New South, based in Morocco. Then I have an almost colleague, Denis Novy, who's Chief Economist of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the United Kingdom. And then we have Omar Ashour, who is a researcher and lecturer in the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. So welcome to all. We are delighted to have you here. I'm going to pass the floor first to Christian de Boissieu, who is an economist in the Cercle, who's going to introduce the theme, intermediate powers, what common interests in the era of empires. Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you and good morning. The topic of today is at once exciting and very difficult. I'm not saying difficult to apologize for what I'm about to say, but it's a relatively new subject which was raised by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in Davos this year. Mark Carney gave a speech which gave rise to a standing ovation in Davos, which we don't see often in Davos, so even here we don't have many standing ovations, in which he introduced the notion of intermediate powers. And he gave Canada as an example. But there are other examples that we will be mentioning because the definition of intermediate powers is still to be forged. We can think of Brazil, and I think that Poland is an intermediate power. France is an intermediate power. Each European country, taken individually today, is an intermediate power. So there is a problem of definition. But what Mark Carney was saying is very interesting. He said, faced with the empires, he's thinking of the states of China. We must add to this Russia, which is still an empire, India, and is no doubt among the great powers. But the list of hegemons at the global level is not infinite. It's quite small. And what Mark Carney was saying, therefore, is that intermediate powers were so far protected by rules that allowed these intermediate powers to exist despite these major powers. And these rules of the games were based on multilateralism, on international organizations which are in crisis today. I'm thinking of the WTO, which is nowhere today. I'm thinking of the International Labour Organization, which fulfills a role. But what Mark Carney was saying is with the rising unilateralism, it is a power struggle. It is the contrary of a state of law to some extent. And the logic of the debate on intermediate powers is the organization between these relatively opposite forces, the power struggle and the state of law. And what Carney was saying is that the intermediate powers must get organized and work together in order to exist. I recommend, if you allow me a recommendation, just read Carney's speech in Davos in January. It is an anti-Trump speech. He does not quote the name of the American president a single time, but it's a far stronger speech as such because he attacks the unilateral approach, he attacks customs duties that were unilaterally imposed by the American president, he attacks the entire foreign policy and international economic policy of Trump without mentioning his name a single time. So one word on Europe. I said earlier on that each European country is in itself an intermediate power. Europe as such, the European Union, we'll talk about this, today I do not classify this as a major power as such. The 27 countries of Europe is not a hegemony and a great power because the addition and collection of intermediate powers does not make a major power. And so the debate for us, which is a debate for the future, are we going to progress in the integration and European governance so that one day we can become a major power? Because the conflict east-west between the States and China does not leave a lot of room for intermediate powers. So the world in which the global South and the North comes up against each other doesn't leave a lot of room for intermediate powers. So I will end by mentioning the subject that I just touched upon. How can the intermediate powers today exist and play a more important role, come up against the major powers? Carney tells us that each intermediate power must develop a network of agreements, bilateral. Canada signed a trade agreement with the European Union. Canada mentioned other trade agreements. Each intermediate power can play on the network effect. But, okay, the idea is good. Considering the fact that we're talking about a very heterogeneous and not very convergent set of countries. Therefore, I cannot see the very fast arrival appearance of a sort of a coalition of intermediate powers at the global level. The BRICS are not this type of coalition because in the BRICS you have big powers and intermediate powers. The G7 is certainly not a coalition of intermediate powers because you have hegemonies in the G7. So today there is no format around which the intermediate powers can come together. And I can make an analogy here with companies. If I take the case of France, we define the association of big companies. I don't need to quote them. The SMEs and also associations, it's far more difficult to bring together intermediate-sized companies. And it's the same thing for countries. Intermediate countries, I believe, will have trouble coming together, but they must make efforts in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Christian. I would like to begin with Europe. We have a Polish minister with us, and I will ask him to give his answer to the following question. How can we ensure that Europe can become an economic power?
Thank you very much for having me. First, I think we need to realize where we are, and I just wanted to quote the words of Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission that comes from Luxembourg, a small country, I think we can all agree. And he once said that all countries in Europe are small, but not all of them yet realize that this is the case. So when we're talking about middle power, it's important, I think, to have this context in mind. To respond to your question, first, I think we need a strategic agenda with our partners outside of the EU. And I think what we offer as EU and what is needed for those middle powers is stability. So we need stable rules and predictability. And when we look at the world today, this is definitely lacking from the big powers, let's say. So what we can bring to the table and what I think we should be trying to agree on is stable rules. The second thing I wanted to mention is closer cooperation with like-minded partners, like the UK, to secure critical supply chains. I think what we're witnessing right now is an interesting phenomena where we're moving from economic efficiency to economic security. And this very much means that we need to focus on those critical supply chains to ensure that our businesses, our economies keep on running, even if China, for example, decides to impose some limits on critical raw minerals, which we've seen. Here the question is, and Christian asked this question about the format of this cooperation with like-minded partners. To some extent, for us at least, G20 could be that format, although it includes also the biggest players. But for me, it's quite obvious that the EU should be at the center of that format. Then the first thing I wanted to mention is trade alliances in general. So I really, and here I fully agree with what has just been said, that we need a network of trade agreements. But on top of that, it would be lovely to see a world with a rules-based order. I'm not sure if that's realistic anymore, but when I think of the World Trade Organization, we all know that it needs to be reformed to be truly rules-based. But I think here we share this interest. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We are now going to move to the African continent, Karim. So from the African continent, you're based in Morocco, and this idea of intermediate powers, how is this understood from your point of view? Thank you. Thank you to the Rencontre Économique for creating this space for discussion. I believe that there is, first of all, we must understand that we don't all see the world in the same way. And Mark Carney's speech is an attempt to rationalize the place of Europe in a changing world. And the idea is, how can we remain relevant when we're no longer in the center? It's understandable, but I think that history shows us that this is no longer the case. Europe is no longer in the center. We're in a post-European world that no doubt began in the 20th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It's a lengthy evolution. I would say that we must be careful not to present the world before as a sort of a lost paradise. I would say simply go and ask the Iraqis, the Libyans, and there is a long list. If it was a lost paradise and it was a perfect world in which international law was respected, it's not the case at all. So if we really want to think together about what we can do together among non-empires, it must be we mustn't come back over our grievances and contrition, but we must engage in a real discussion about what we can do together. The second point is that it's already underway. Just look at the country like Morocco. We've just published a paper here that looks over the past 5 years of the post-COVID development. And you can see that that country has seen a growth per head of about 3.2% over the past 5 years. It's a case of a country such as Vietnam as well. We can also talk about Spain, which is quite similar. And the driving force behind all this is foreign direct investment. European, but also Chinese, this is increasing. And a reorganization of value chains around what you were saying. Of course, profits, but also the aspects of strategic autonomy. If that's where we can talk. What does Europe want to do with the Mediterranean, for example, in terms of strategic autonomy? We have an in-depth partnership. And so this question for me is at the heart. globalization has not come to a halt. It still continues, although, there are problems between the States and China. We don't have time to come back over that, but most countries want to continue to export, in particular countries of the South. I would like to remind you that the challenge of the countries of the South is that of development, and being a connecting country or bringing a solution to the geopolitical transformation of the world is not a growth strategy. The basic problems of productivity, education, access to healthcare, etc., remain. The climate response and the demographic stakes are still there, and they're things that we share with advanced countries, not at the same scale or with the same acuteness. But to end, I think that, in a chaotic, risky world where, you can get hurt, if your inner front is weak, if there's a strong polarization of societies, if you have problems of intergenerational equity, then you are vulnerable. You must be careful not to overreact. I think there's also an overreaction among politicians because they want to reassure us and show that they control things, whereas nothing is under control. And the danger is overreaction. So I think each country must get organized and really have a societal debate, an in-depth debate on how we want to fit into the world, in what way, with whom, and how to find a solidarity and build this. And this has already started. You just need to look at, we're in France, just look at the itineraries of the President Macron. And you can understand that he's posing the first bases of new partnerships to be built. And I will end on this, Mrs. Pedder, just to say one word. I think that we don't talk enough in depth. In a country such as Morocco and our neighbours, Tunisia, for example, we have association agreements with the European Union since 1969. Today, it's a free trade agreement, and we have it also with the States, but particularly with Europe. But there are no in-depth, real discussions. Let's leave aside the official channels, etc. We know each other very well there. But let's come back and look at this strategic history. There is a sort of a blockage which is still there. And there's this giuramento, which must be held at different levels. So to build a solution that is meaningful for us and for the others. Thank you very much.
And to think about what it really means to move from an objective of economic efficiency to an objective of economic security. How do you see the stakes and the opportunities?
Okay. Bonjour, je suis très heureux d'être ici, mais...
Good morning, I'm very happy to be here, but I'm going to speak in English if you will allow.
Government, the Foreign Office in particular. And I'm going to get to this point that Sophie asked about efficiency and security in a minute. I'd say the way we like to think about intermediary powers or middle powers is in terms of agile alliances. We know that the world is moving very fast. We don't quite know what the world will look like in 5 to 10, let alone 20 years from now. But what we do know with very high certainty is that we have to be faster, we have to be adjustable, and we have to look at different problems, sometimes with different partners. And let me start with what is the largest national security concern for the United Kingdom, that is Russia. The threat from Russia on the Eastern Front and the terrible war in Ukraine. And the UK is very proud to be so involved with helping Ukraine. And of course, this is a much wider initiative with so many other partners in Europe, and that has to continue. And we have to work together with the EU, but also more broadly with other countries, with NATO, to increase the cost and make it really difficult for the Russian government and President Putin to continue that war. That has to be really, really important. And it's not just in Ukraine, it's also in Europe. And I was actually in Poland recently, and what we see in Poland is we have these small-scale things that are happening. For example, Russia is paying some agents to do small things, like distribute leaflets, or maybe some not so small things, like disturbing train lines and little attacks. And what we know from experience, it doesn't take long for those acts of aggression and state terrorism to come over to other countries, including the UK. We've had killings in the UK that were orchestrated by the Russian security services. And that is absolutely essential for us to continue that work. I would also like to point out the importance of NATO in this context. This might not be so popular in many parts of the European continent, but we have to spend more money on defense, and I think it's really difficult for politicians these days because of the budgetary pressures. We have that here in France, we struggle with that in the UK and pretty much everywhere else. We need to spend more money on defense, and we need to talk more about those issues. And this is again something that we have to do more of in Europe. There's a lot of criticism and difficult relations with the United States at the moment, but the Americans are right that the Europeans have to spend more money on that. That's a very difficult message, but we have to be realistic. I then want to go on to another part of the world that is really important to us, and Karim was talking a lot about that, which is other areas in the world where there's unbelievable suffering and humanitarian trouble. Sudan is the biggest humanitarian disaster of the 21st century. There's more than 30 million people affected by that. There's unbelievable violence against women and girls, and that topic is so important. It is such unbelievable scale of human suffering. It does not get enough attention in the media. So the UK again is working on that very, very closely. Our Foreign Secretary is very focused on that. And that means working with other partners, working with Egypt, working with the Gulf, again, working with the United States. So different problems sometimes require different alliances. Another somewhat different alliance is climate. We see a lot of leadership, for example, from Caribbean countries, from Barbados, from Jamaica, disaster risk finance. How can we have insurance mechanisms against climate change, against hurricanes? That's going to be another very, very important issue that we need to work on, probably with, again, slightly different partners, but that underlines this point about agile alliances. The last thing I want to say is the G7 summit that was just held very successfully in Evian here in France, and we will hold the G7 presidency next year in the United Kingdom. We want to continue a lot of the topics that the French have led on in the G7 context, and again that will require talking to different partners. The G20 is a much larger group with very different interests, so you have to talk to different people in different ways. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Omar.
Omar.
Let's link into the question of defense security, how middle powers can or can hope to reinforce their own autonomy. What's the view from where you sit in the middle of the Gulf?
Oh, in the middle of the Gulf, okay. So I was going to start with Europe, but first I very much agree with what my colleague, Mr. Denis Novi, has mentioned right now. I just have three remarks that apply to the Gulf, but also to Europe. The first one is it's a much more dangerous environment now for smaller and middle states, and I'm very glad that we were reminded that Europe and the Gulf is made of two types of state, as the famous Belgian statesman mentioned: small states and states that did not realize so far that they are small. So it's very much more dangerous. Why? Because the main guarantor of the post-Cold War international system, that is the United States, is not interested and more seeing that it's more costly to maintain that system. So it's withdrawing. So I always give the two extreme examples of the Gulf and Europe. In 1991, when Iraq invaded a larger state, invaded a small state, Kuwait, the United States mobilized over 900,000 soldiers with a multinational coalition that include African, Asian, and European countries, and liberated Kuwait in about 100 hours of ground fighting and 37-day air campaign. And it ended there, and it was a clear signal that a violation of that level by a larger state against a smaller state will not be tolerated. Fast forward to 2014 here in Europe. The Russian Federation, via a hybrid, very successful hybrid operation, it only succeeded once in Crimea. It was tried in Kharkiv and in other parts of Ukraine. It did not succeed, but it succeeded 100% in Crimea. Annexed the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine. Kuwait did not have a defense agreement with the US. The defense agreement was signed in September 1991 after the liberation. Ukraine had a Budapest Memorandum for security assurances guaranteed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation. One of the signatories invaded, and the two others didn't do much. Actually, the Obama administration then advised them not to fight, so they do not get massacred. So you have two contrasts. One, there was no 900,000 multinational coalition to liberate Crimea. There was an advice not to fight back and will try sanctions and diplomacy. So that's the difference between the... So this predates Trump. That lack of interest in maintaining or investing the international system post-Cold War predates Trump. So that's one, a very dangerous environment. But the second bit, which is more positive, is that small, and it is being proven almost in every new conflict that it is very difficult to take down a state. It is very difficult to impose regime change. It is very difficult to invade. Again, Crimea is an exception. But a May 1940 Belgium, France, or a 2003 episode in Iraq, or 2001 episode in Afghanistan, that's very difficult to repeat. Ukraine is proving this every day, I think. The February 2022 failed on all aspects. The invasion by Russia, so failed in the regime change. The army did not collapse. The people were not celebrating. So all the assumptions were wrong. And Ukraine now, which in 2021 looked at as a de facto recognition of the annexation of Crimea, it is now isolating Crimea with its capabilities. If you looked at Iran, we have a similar situation. Over 21,000 strikes by the Americans and the Israelis, decapitation of the entire leadership, political, partly military, and also spiritual, the Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah, and the regime still there, with a counter strikes. Finished the 40 days with a wave of strikes on Israel and 100 strikes on the Gulf. So standing on both legs, punching with both hands. So it's an indicator that even if you're a smaller state, the same thing applies vis-a-vis the UAE, for example. The UAE withstood over 2,500 drone attacks, drones and loitering munitions, and over 500 ballistic missiles. Also, the regime did not collapse. There's no invasion. So it is very difficult, and there's a reason for that, and we can talk about it in terms of technology, regeneration of forces, and finally now, strategic autonomy. I think it was mentioned by all my colleagues. Strategic autonomy now is a destiny. If you want to maintain the sovereignty of smaller and middle powers, then there is no other way except to follow a current 2026 Ukrainian model. That's meaning more, of course, in terms of defense budgets, but the money doesn't fight on its own. The money, the technology, the geography, all this you can employ. They don't fight on their own. You still need the mobilization. I think one of my colleagues in Qatar was telling me, okay, now it's all autonomous systems, right? And uncrewed and unmanned system. The drone is manned. For some of the systems, some of the drone systems, you will need 4 operators. A pilot, a navigator, a munitions officer, and a logistician. That's 4 people. 4 men or women for one drone system, depending on the type. That's actually more than a crew of a T-72 Russian tank. So the T-72 needs 3 people, you know. So you'll still need the 4th generation, which needs mobilization, which needs more people in the armed forces. So in the UK, with 72,000 strong British army, that's not enough, okay? And these will raise some questions on conscription, on force structure, on force design, on also procurement and other basics. It will need to be hybrid. And in this case, not hybrid war, but hybrid defense. That is more collaboration between the civilian side and the folks in the uniform. So that, if the strategic objective is to maintain economy, to defend against very aggressive adversaries, I think I'll end with a quote with the Foreign Minister Sikorski of Poland. He was on the BBC Newsnight the other day, and he gave us a figure of how much the UK spends on defense and on welfare. 65 billion for defense and over 360 billion on welfare. So it's about 5 times. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. Minister, can I come back to you? Because one of the things that always strikes me is that, on the whole, the analysis is very good, excellent. We can lay down what needs to happen. But what's so difficult is doing it. And that's your job. I wonder if, in particular, you could take us through what Poland has done, because Poland has increased massively defense spending. It's exactly what Dennis mentioned that we all ought to be doing. What do you spend less on if you're spending more on defense?
Thank you. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I would say it all comes down to political will and the eagerness of politicians to spend the so-called political capital. But first, to be able to do this, you need this realization of the situation you're in. And I think in Poland, the threat of Russia is very well understood. So at least in our case, when we discuss those issues with the public, there's no really much need to explain that Russia is a proper threat. Even right now, after those many years of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think people are getting tired of the situation, but they still keep on remembering that Russia might use, for example, hybrid warfare, which my UK colleague mentioned. So still, we need to make sure that we are secure. I don't think in general there's an easy answer to that. I often get asked about why the EU is working so slowly. It's a similar question to some extent. Why we don't do the things that need to be done, even though we know that they need to be done. And it's really about the political will. The political will, from my experience, comes from the general public understanding the issues. So then we go back way to the question of education, the role of social media. Probably this goes beyond our panel. But just to defend the EU, that's probably my role. Maybe we're slow, but we're stable. And stability really matters in this world. And also, again, to answer the question from the title of our panel, stability, I think, is something that we should all strive for.
Stability and our great strength is regulation. We know how to do things, right?
Probably we do a bit too much of regulation. So some of you might be aware that right now we keep on having those exercises at the EU level, but actually also in Poland, we have a deregulation task force. I'm not sure if France is 100% on board, probably not always. But we all know that we need to learn to make those rules simpler. But again, there is a question of stability of those rules, and I think we all know we need those rules.
Karim, on peut parler encore du...
Karim, we can talk about Africa again. what would be the opportunities, the leveraging tools for the emerging powers in Africa? How can they act as middle powers? Could you give us a survey of the African continent? I think that what I said early on, it is the challenge of growth, be they intermediate income countries or low income countries. Basically, the stake is growth, and they want to keep trading. They want to keep trading. I'm referring you to the free trade zone, Pan-African free trade zone, which is a major project, and all countries in Africa want to maintain. There is a scope for development which would come from the gain coming from trade. It is a continent which is still highly committed in international trade, clearly. Second, Africa is not warmongering. It has no geostrategic or hegemonic ambitions. Of course, there are issues in Sudan, in Libya, but often are internal, domestic struggles. They're not interstate wars. I do believe that, especially with our European neighbors, a lot can be done. Let's take the example of power, energy, green energy, hydrogen, in connected infrastructures and cables between Europe and Africa, or production of renewable energy, although it becomes profitable in Europe now, considering the situation now. But, clearly there is more sun in Africa. And there are a certain number of countries which can play quite a significant role as a driver in their region, with the regional clusters around which, the economy is reorganized. Well, Morocco and its region, then the country Ethiopia in its region, probably other countries in West Africa, possibly. We could think about Ivory Coast. But it means that, this implies that you're successful. You have to do well. You have to be able to deal with the complex world. You must have a society that is committed, ready to do reforms. And I do believe that somehow this kind of a chaotic world reveals our weaknesses and our strengths, but in a sharper way, a less tolerant way. We have little margin for error, actually. What's interesting, and this is what I wanted to say early on, is that we don't look at each other the same way. The strategic value of countries has changed, especially seen from Europe. Europe is no longer looking at Africa as it used to look at it before Trump, if you want. And I think this is a key point. We are becoming interesting. They want to seduce us, which was not quite the case. They need us in partnerships to manage issues of strategic autonomies. And I think it's all very interesting. It's part of the aggiornamento that I mentioned, because in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, everybody has worked according to, based on a mode, the careers, trainings, their brains have been shaped, and changes come slowly. And this is what you said, it's difficult to change. We know we got to brush our teeth every morning, but my God, it's boring. So it's very much the same thing. We procrastinate, we're not very efficient. As individuals and collectively speaking, it's even worse. So this is why I do believe, I come from the world of the academic world, I do believe in sites, in sorts of, let's say, clinics of public policy, to do psychoanalysis of public policies. Why is it is complicated in France to have some years before you can actually retire, whereas there is almost an existential threat looming over the system. So it's human, but this is this is what we have to overcome. Europe, and I'll close on that note, it's the problem of the end of the road. Everybody wants to be a little petit bourgeois. Of course, everybody, individually, we all want to be petit bourgeois. Senegal, Morocco, Poland, Vietnam, we all want to be petit bourgeois. But to be a petit bourgeois is to die a bit, so Well, we fall asleep. It's like the frog in the water. You know, the temperature increases. Say the frog in the cold water and hot water pot. So anyway, this is the way human beings function too. Christian, you wish to add something? Thank you, Sophie. I would like to react to 2 points. Europe, you were several to talk Europe. When can we get a powerful Europe? Well, under what condition? Well, there is a true problem here of contradictions. To be an economic power, the 27 have to move together for economic, demographic, energy, and so on issues. But in terms of European governance, to go further, we won't be able to move to make headways with being 27. This is the contradiction, so we have to accept at the European level, in order to go further, to set ourselves on the international stage in these discussions which are over us now in terms of geopolitics. We Europeans have to accept that we will move on with countries that want to do it and can do it. We are already in a Europe with a variable geometry. Look at defense. It's not 27. And thank you to the United Kingdom to stay with us when it comes to defense. Euro, we're not 27, we're 21. Schengen, we're not 27, we're 26. 22 countries plus 4. So basically, I want to raise this issue of internal European contradiction. To be an economic power, we have to be together, and we can do it. And last point, Carney said in January, the problem of middle countries is that they're often on the menus, very seldom sitting at the table. So yesterday I was moderating a session on Africa. African countries, they're often on the menu, seldom sitting at the table. So our friend from Poland was mentioning the issue I raised about the format. When it comes to global governance, middle powers and global governance. And I do believe that you were saying G20 is the less worst situation, better for G7, to associate, because we associate a certain number of emerging or middle countries. But I do believe in the reform of institutions. It is difficult. This is why this concept of middle countries or intermediate countries, it might be a temporary, it's a transition state, the transition condition. So either you up or you down, you climb up or you drop down. And I'd like to ask our friends, especially the Polish minister, can we go further in the proper format at the global level of a community of so-called middle countries? So what would be the right format?
Allez-y.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I got everything you said, but there was this interesting concept, I'm not sure if you had it, of Canada joining the EU. But this still shows us that EU as a concept, as a mechanism is interesting. And I think my French homologue keeps on making this point that EU is attractive, and the best proof for that is that we have 9 countries that want to join. I don't think there are any countries that want to join United States of America right now. So we're still very very attractive. I don't have a right answer to you when it comes to the new format. What we see right now, at least in Europe, not in EU, but in Europe, we have those changing issue-based formats. And it has proven to be relatively successful and quite efficient, although I do believe in structure. So I think structure is helpful. This structure also builds trust among countries. But building yet another organization, yet another global organization, I think would be problematic today.
Thank you, Minister. We've got 5 more minutes between us, so I'd just like to bring in our other 2 panelists, if I may. Dennis, what do you think about the question of you sit in the UK? Obviously, we're not part of the EU. Where does that leave the sort of options? What are the best levers? What are the best assets that the UK can play on or play with in order to exist as a middle power?
Right, so it depends on the topic. I mean, since you mentioned the EU and it's come up, EU-UK relations have been difficult. We all know that. Brexit has not been easy, and it continues to be very difficult on many levels. However, it is very clear that there's a lot of common ground between the UK and the European Union. I mean, we mentioned Russia, we mentioned our security threats, we mentioned defense and NATO, largely overlapping with the EU. So that is all really, really important, where we can work together very well. We can work very well on science and lots of other issues, and that might require different fora. So it's a big, it's a priority for the UK government to get closer to the European Union and to get closer again to the single market, or to work as closely as we possibly can within the current constraints. I just want to say a few things more on military cooperation. So the French president and the UK Prime Minister have been leading an initiative to try to help with the Strait of Hormuz, try to help it up again. This is all depending on how things will play in the next few days and weeks. But demining could potentially be happening. And that is something where Europeans can work together very well, and other European countries are involved. There's a very strong defense alliance with Poland, for example, with Italy, and there's so much that we can do and that we really need to do. One other thing I want to say, going back to what Karim was saying, in a lot of the developing world, maybe that's even like a strange phrase to use, emerging economies, maybe we should say, the model, what they ask for is quite different from what a lot of politicians or what a lot of people in the public debate think here. It's not about handouts or money. It's actually about helping countries to grow by themselves and getting access to expertise, getting access to financial markets. So I'm now in a very privileged position where I can speak to a lot of governments, a lot of policymakers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also other parts of the world. And they don't want money. They actually want help with access to financial markets. We have financial markets in Europe, especially in the UK, and we have private financing. How can we make sure that we actually look much more towards Africa and other parts of the world? Climate is a big one. So that's, I think, where we have to be very creative, and we also have to be much faster. I mean, this is really frustrating. I think people just, even with domestic issues, get frustrated by this. Things take years and years and years and years. We have to be much faster.
Thank you. And you mentioned the coalition for the Strait of Hormuz, but there's also the coalition for Ukraine, which the UK and France have worked incredibly well together to put together, which is also encouraging. Omar, you've got the last word. We've got 2 minutes. From where you are based, when you look at Europe and you listen to the debates that we're having about how to exist as a power or as different powers, how does it look from your window?
On the Gulf, or from the Gulf, they realized that alliances work, okay? Put everything aside that in the media, and there is anger, you know, the idea that the US unilaterally took that decision and made the region even more threatening, so there is some of that. There's also the Gaza issue, which is a big deal in the Gulf region, with regards how to get it resolved. Now Gaza and Lebanon, and some criticism via the EU policy, but primarily American and Israeli policies. But that's on the, shall we say, the critical side. But also there's more and more realization that the systems and the alliance with the US and with the West is very important. Why? because the air defense munitions and the system that defended the skies of the Gulf were almost entirely American or European. The training, the doctrine, the munitions were there. So the Patriot interceptor rates were very high. The THAAD interceptor rates were very high. There was some vulnerabilities on the lower echelons. That's why they needed Ukraine, and Ukraine sent over 250 trainers and manufacturers, and also a company level strong force to the Gulf, to all of the, I think, 5 countries, maybe not Oman, I'm not sure about Oman. So there is realization that this is a working relationship and should be maintained. But there's also, so this is on operational or sub-operational level, tactical and technological, technical. But on a strategic level, there's this look that if the US can launch a war of that size without any consultancies with any of the, some at least of the Gulf regions, then this will put the region in a strategic, dangerous environment.
Thank you, Omar. We've come to the end of our debate among the panelists, but Christian now has the job of offering some concluding thoughts. Christian.
Not playing with words. I did an intermediary intervention, and they consider, therefore, that I will not do something, will not say anything. Thank you all. It was a fascinating, the topic is highly complex. I think it was fascinating. Thank you, gentlemen. Coming out of this, I'm not sure we've made progress as to the concept of middle powers, but we've made progress in terms of global geopolitics and all of Europe. Thank you very much. Thank you.